She banged on my door with the fury of a woman scorned, screaming that her guests had arrived and I was ruining her party by keeping my cabin locked, as if my private lake property was part of her backyard barbecue. I had come to the lake for peace. That cabin, tucked between the pines and a stretch of glistening water, was my sanctuary. I wasn't looking for drama. I wasn't trying to pick a fight. But apparently, drama had a name, and it was Marlene. HOA president, local tyrant, and self-declared queen of the lakeside community, Marlene strutted around as if the sun rose from her backyard deck and set behind her perfectly trimmed shrubs. She had been a problem since the day I bought the cabin, giving me sideways glances at HOA meetings even though I technically wasn't under their jurisdiction. My property sat just outside the official HOA map, something she hated with the heat of 1,000 summer suns. The trouble began when I pulled into my gravel driveway on a quiet Friday morning. I had a week off work and a cooler full of steaks, expecting nothing more stressful than deciding between fishing or reading by the fire pit. I didn't even make it to the front porch before I noticed unfamiliar cars parked along the road. Luxury SUVs with tinted windows lined the edge of the lake path. A banner that read "Welcome Lakeview Retreat Guests" was strung up between two trees, on my side of the water. I stared at it, blinked, and stared again. I knew the HOA occasionally hosted community gatherings, but this was new. Before I could ask any questions, Marlene materialized out of nowhere in a pastel blazer, clipboard in hand and sunglasses perched on her forehead like a general preparing for battle. She approached with a fake smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh good, you made it," she said as if we were on speaking terms. "Listen, I've got some guests staying this weekend. Little mix-up with booking the lodge. I told them we'd use your cabin for overflow. Hope you don't mind. Just unlock it and I'll handle everything." I thought she was joking. I laughed, waiting for her to join in. She didn't. "You what now?" I asked. "Your place," she said, gesturing to my locked cabin like it was a spare garden shed. "You know, since it's just you, I figured you'd be flexible. It's such a lovely space. They only need it for 2 nights. We'll clean up afterward. Promise." "You figured wrong," I replied. "That's not happening." Her face changed instantly, the smile crumbling like stale pie crust. I didn't even wait for her to argue. I pushed past her and went straight to the door, unlocking it for myself and walking in, closing it behind me. She stood outside, stunned, before storming off like a cartoon villain denied her favorite color. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. I tried to ignore the steady stream of HOA members setting up tables and speakers near the public dock. I could hear laughter, music, and the constant hum of conversation drifting through the trees. At one point, someone even tried to park in my driveway. I had to come out and remind them it wasn't a shared space. They looked confused, like Marlene had told them otherwise. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped below the trees and the air turned gold, I heard rustling near the side of the cabin. I stayed quiet, listening. A metallic scraping. I tiptoed to the back window and peeked through the blind. 2 silhouettes crouched near the back door. One held something shiny. Bolt cutters. They were trying to break in. I flipped on the porch lights and banged on the glass. They bolted like deer caught in headlights. I called the local sheriff's office, heart pounding. A deputy arrived half an hour later, but instead of checking the property or asking questions, he started with a sigh. "Sir, my Aunt Marlene tells me there's a misunderstanding here. Maybe you could be a bit more neighborly," he said with the energy of a man who'd rather be fishing. "Neighborly doesn't mean handing over private property to strangers," I snapped. He nodded but didn't write anything down. After he left, I stood on the porch for a while, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. The party noise had died down. Crickets chirped, and an owl hooted in the distance. Peaceful again, for now. The next morning, I found a neon orange tag taped to my cabin door. Notice of violation. According to the paper, I was in breach of HOA Code 14B regarding community participation. I wasn't even a member. That didn't stop Marlene from trying to enforce rules that didn't apply to me. I crumpled the notice and tossed it into the fireplace without a second thought. I went into town for groceries later that day. At the local diner, I overheard two women chatting at the next table. They were excited about their weekend retreat and said they'd paid almost $1,000 each for an authentic lakeside experience. One of them showed the other a photo of my cabin from a booking site. I felt the air leave my lungs. Marlene had listed my cabin for rent. She was charging strangers to stay in a property she didn't own. That night, I checked every short-term rental app one could find. Sure enough, there it was. Lakefront escape. Sleeps 6. Fire pit, private dock, no host interaction. The pictures were mine, ones I'd posted once on social media. She'd stolen them and turned them into a fake listing. I took screenshots of everything. The next day, I locked the gate across my driveway. I posted a sign at the edge of my property line. Private property. No trespassing. Marlene showed up again, face tight with rage, demanding I respect community expectations. I told her I'd respect the law, and if she stepped foot on my porch again, I'd call the real sheriff this time. As she walked away, I realized this wasn't over. It wasn't about a cabin or guests anymore. It was about control, and she had just picked the wrong man to play games with. By Monday morning, the war had gone from weird to absurd. I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires and looked outside to see a white utility truck pulling up beside the cabin. Two men in orange vests stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began walking along the perimeter of my property like they were on a mission. One of them took photos of my dock, while the other squatted near the garden beds, muttering about code violations. I threw on a shirt and stepped outside before they got any closer to the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to stay calm despite the surge of irritation bubbling inside me. One of the men looked up and said they were from the HOA compliance team. I told them I wasn't part of the HOA. He flipped a sheet on his clipboard and said that was under review. Under review. As if they could retroactively drag me into their circus of nonsense. They pointed to a list of supposed violations I had racked up over the weekend, including untrimmed reeds, non-conforming mailbox color, and dock size exceeding aesthetic guidelines. I asked if they knew this was county property, not governed by HOA zoning. They shrugged and said any disputes would need to be settled at the next board meeting. I walked back inside before I said something I'd regret. Within an hour, a bright orange warning flag was staked right in the middle of my flower bed, stating pending review. It flapped in the breeze like a cheap insult. I took a picture of it and sent it to my lawyer, who replied with a single sentence. "Do not remove it yet. Take note of everything." Later that day, I walked down to the dock to clear my head, only to find a printed paper nailed to one of the beams. It read "Community Asset" in bold red letters. I laughed out loud. They were escalating, but they were also getting sloppy. You don't nail signs to property you don't own unless you're desperate. I pulled the paper off and stuffed it into a folder with the others. Evidence was piling up quickly. Aunt Ruth called me that evening. She'd seen one of the HOA emails circulating among old board members. Marlene had apparently sent out a mass message claiming I was planning to sell my property to a developer. She framed it as a crisis that required urgent HOA intervention to preserve community harmony. Ruth had replied asking for proof, and the message thread mysteriously vanished. That was when she knew something shady was going on. I asked Ruth about the original bylaws and zoning maps from when the lake community was founded. She promised to dig through her storage and find the original documentation. If we could prove, officially and publicly, that my land was exempt from HOA control, Marlene's entire campaign would unravel. In the meantime, I decided to stop playing defense. The next morning, I installed 3 motion-activated trail cameras along the edge of my property. I also placed a game cam near the back entrance of the cabin and another near the dock. I wasn't taking chances. If anyone stepped foot where they didn't belong again, I'd catch them in the act. I also reinforced the cabin's locks and added a chain across the front porch entrance. Petty maybe, but necessary. That same afternoon, I received a letter in the mail that looked like it had been printed in a hurry. It was from the HOA board, summoning me to a community mediation session. The language was hilariously formal. Concerned parties wished to resolve perceived tensions related to shared community values. I read it 3 times and still couldn't stop laughing. I almost considered framing it. I called the number at the bottom and told them I wouldn't be attending. They said attendance was mandatory. I told them I'd see them in court. The night brought another surprise. While sipping coffee on the porch, I noticed movement at the edge of the property near the old tool shed. I switched on the floodlight and saw a woman crouching beside the foundation with what looked like a measuring tape. When the light hit her face, she gasped and sprinted off into the trees. I didn't need to guess who she was. A new nameplate had shown up at the HOA board listing her as the new property compliance officer. Another Marlene puppet. The next morning, I printed out every screenshot I had collected from the short-term rental listings. I printed out the map showing the zoning boundary, the property deed, and a photo of the no trespassing sign I had installed. I dropped all of it into a manila folder labeled evidence and locked it in the cabin's safe. My next move would need to be strategic. One thing was clear though. Marlene wasn't just being pushy anymore. She was orchestrating a calculated power grab, hoping I would either give in or pack up and leave. Instead of doing either, I invited a few fellow property owners over for a small get-together. People who had also faced Marlene's overreach. We grilled burgers, sat by the fire pit and shared stories. One guy named Alan said she once tried to fine him for hanging a canoe upside down under his deck. Another woman said Marlene rewrote the minutes from a board meeting to erase a vote that didn't go her way. By the end of the night, we had an informal alliance forming. Not everyone was ready to fight, but they were tired of her games. The next day, I walked out to find a fresh orange notice taped to the power box on the side of the cabin. This one accused me of electrical code violations. I nearly laughed. There was no HOA code authority over utility infrastructure, but they were clearly hoping I didn't know that. I photographed it, peeled it off, and added it to the evidence pile. It was becoming clear that Marlene's strategy was to bury me in so many fake violations, letters, and scare tactics that I'd give up out of exhaustion. What she didn't know was I had more patience than she had schemes. I was playing the long game. And soon enough, her carefully built house of fake authority would start to crack. All I needed was one public misstep. And I had a feeling it was coming soon. The guests she lied to were still expecting a cabin stay. And Marlene had promised them mine. That lie was going to collide with reality in the most beautiful way. The next morning I woke up to the sound of my name being shouted from down the road. I opened the front door and saw Marlene standing by the edge of my driveway in high heels, waving a laminated folder in one hand like she was about to auction off beachfront property. She was accompanied by a man in a suit with a rolled-up blueprint under his arm and a woman clutching a coffee mug that read Community First in pink letters. Marlene looked at me with that overly polite smile that always meant something terrible was about to follow. "Good morning," she called. "I'd love a quick word about the Neighborhood Redevelopment Initiative." I didn't answer. I just stared. She took a step closer but didn't cross onto the gravel. "We're working on a proposal to revitalize the lakefront experience. New trails, a community event deck, public access spaces, and we'd love your cooperation in unlocking the cabin so our consultant can take a look inside." I leaned on the doorframe and said nothing. Her smile twitched. She clearly didn't expect silence. The man with the blueprint looked uncomfortable. I could tell he wasn't fully briefed on what was really going on. Marlene pressed on. "I understand there's been a little tension lately, but this is a chance to be part of something bigger. Think legacy." I closed the door gently but firmly. Through the window I watched her deflate like a punctured pool float. The man looked at her, said something I couldn't hear, and they all left with clipped footsteps and a badly concealed air of defeat. That same afternoon I checked the cabin's exterior cameras. Late the previous night someone had come by and taped up a fake notice on my gate reading Preliminary Acquisition Assessment Zone. It was printed on county letterhead, but the font was wrong and the signature line had no name. I knew right away it was forged. I took it down and filed it with everything else. Later I drove into town to have it reviewed at the zoning office. The clerk took one look and shook his head. Not only was it fake, but impersonating a county authority could carry serious legal consequences. I asked him if the HOA had any pending applications involving my property. He said none had been filed. He printed out a fresh copy of the zoning map, showing in black and white that my land sat completely outside HOA jurisdiction. I asked for 3 certified copies. That night I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the reflection of the stars shimmer on the lake's surface. My phone buzzed. Aunt Ruth had emailed me the old HOA bylaws she'd found in a dusty box in her basement. I opened the PDF and started reading. It was full of procedural language, but one clause stood out. If a sitting HOA president is found to have engaged in personal profiteering through misrepresentation of community assets, the board may vote for immediate removal with full documentation and member consent. I reread it 3 times. It was exactly what I needed. Now I just had to prove it. I decided to take a stroll down to the shared dock area and see how things were shaping up for Marlene's so-called retreat. Sure enough, several folding tables were already set up and paper lanterns hung from trees. A stack of folding chairs sat on the grass with printed name tags attached. Someone had clearly put effort into this. But then I noticed something that made me stop cold. A laminated welcome sign taped to a tree listed the cabin as a scheduled lounge and resting suite. In smaller text it even mentioned complimentary access to the private fire pit and hammock area. My hammock. My fire pit. She had doubled down on the lie. I took photos of everything. As I walked back up the hill, I passed one of Marlene's assistants, who gave me a look of poorly concealed annoyance. She said something under her breath about being difficult and stormed off when I asked her to repeat it. When I got back to the cabin, I uploaded all the photos and organized them into a folder. I also pulled up the rental site again and found that the cabin listing had been edited with new pictures and a note that read verified by HOA management. I took screenshots of everything. This wasn't just irritating anymore. It was criminal. Later that evening I received a knock at the door. It was Alan, one of the neighbors I'd hosted at the barbecue. He looked concerned. "Thought you should see this," he said, holding out his phone. It was a text message thread between him and another resident. Apparently Marlene had begun circulating a rumor that I was selling the cabin to a corporate timeshare company and that she was trying to stop it to protect property values. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped his phone. It was the perfect mix of manipulative and ridiculous. I thanked him and took a screenshot of the thread for documentation. The following day I stopped by the local cafe for breakfast and overheard 2 more guests arriving for the retreat. One of them mentioned being excited to stay in the waterfront suite and pointed toward my cabin. I approached and gently asked how they booked it. They said they paid through a friend of the HOA president and were promised a luxury stay with full lake access. I gave them my card and told them I was the owner of the cabin and it had never been listed for rent. Their smiles dropped immediately. One of them asked if they'd been scammed. I told them to ask Marlene for a refund. As I walked out, I could hear them whispering to each other with growing anger. Back at the cabin, I checked the trail cams again and found footage from the night before. Around 2 in the morning, someone had crept onto my deck and tried the door handle. It didn't open. They looked into the window, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't recognize the face, but they were wearing the same assistant badge I had seen earlier at the event site. I emailed the footage to my lawyer. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was attempted trespassing, property misrepresentation, and maybe even fraud. By sunset I had everything I needed. I sat at the table and laid out each document, each photo, each screenshot. It was a wall of truth. Marlene had lied to guests, forged documents, spread false rumors, and tried to muscle her way into my home for personal profit. I was no longer playing defense. I was preparing to strike. And I had just uncovered the one clause in the bylaws that could end her presidency for good. All I needed was the right moment. And from the look of things, it would be here sooner than she expected. Her guests were arriving. Her lies were stacking. And my cabin door was still locked tight. The sun rose slow and heavy that Saturday, casting a golden sheen across the lake as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. I stood on my porch sipping coffee and listening to the distant hum of engines as SUVs rolled down the gravel path. One by one they pulled into the field near the common area, unloading guests in polo shirts and sundresses, some carrying coolers, others selfie stick. I watched from behind the porch screen, arms crossed, as they milled around waiting for direction. Marlene appeared about 20 minutes later, arms outstretched like she was hosting a red carpet gala. She welcomed them with air kisses, pointing out trees as if she had planted them herself, all while avoiding a single glance in my direction. Around mid-morning, a large pontoon boat floated up to the dock, decorated with ribbons and a banner that read Lakeside Bliss Weekend. It was overkill in every sense, and yet no one seemed to question how extravagant things had become for a supposedly community-centered retreat. Music started playing from hidden speakers and tables were set with catered food trays. The whole thing felt like a corporate picnic mixed with a real estate scam. I walked back inside and pulled the folder marked evidence from my cabinet. I added a few fresh photos I had just taken from the porch. There was no denying it now. She was hosting a full commercial event on HOA grounds, and she was still promising my private cabin as a feature. Around noon, I noticed a group of well-dressed guests lingering near my gate. One of them tried to open it, found it locked, and then looked confused. After a brief discussion, one of them walked up to my porch and knocked, lightly but persistently. I opened the door halfway and asked if I could help them. The woman smiled nervously and asked if this was the check-in for the cabin stay. She had a printed confirmation with my address and her name, promising full weekend access and a lakeside suite. I stepped outside and calmly told her that this was my personal property, not for rent, and that I had never authorized any listing. Her eyes widened as she looked back at the rest of her group, clearly stunned. She asked if I was sure. I told her I was more than sure. I was the legal owner and I could prove it. She looked genuinely hurt, not angry, just blindsided. She explained that she had wired over $800 to a woman she assumed worked for the HOA. She showed me a payment confirmation with a name that wasn't Marlene's, but the connection was obvious. I asked her if she would be willing to write a statement about the interaction. At first, she hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. She said she didn't want anyone else getting taken advantage of. I offered her a bottle of cold water and thanked her before she returned to her group and began making phone calls. I went back inside and added her screenshots and the receipt to the growing folder. By late afternoon, whispers had begun circling the party. Guests were murmuring, pointing toward my cabin, and checking their phones. Marlene was clearly trying to control the narrative, walking quickly from group to group with fake smiles and reassurances. But the damage was done. The woman I had spoken with earlier had posted in the community's social group about her experience. Comments poured in within minutes. Others began to wonder if they too had been misled. Some guests started packing up early. Others demanded to speak with Marlene directly. One man stood by the catering table loudly questioning who was pocketing the event fees. In the middle of the chaos, someone unplugged the speaker system. The music cut off mid-song, and a strange quiet fell over the gathering. Marlene clapped her hands and tried to regain control, calling it a minor technical glitch and urging everyone to stay for the evening paddleboarding session. But the energy had shifted. It was no longer a celebration. It was unraveling right in front of her. I stayed on my porch, watching without a word, letting it all collapse under the weight of her own lies. As the sun dipped low again and the sky turned tangerine, a sheriff deputy pulled into the drive. Not the same one from before, thankfully. This one had the steady, no-nonsense air of someone who didn't take sides. He stepped onto my property and introduced himself politely, then asked if he could speak to me about some complaints received from event guests. I invited him inside, showed him my ownership documents, the evidence folder, and the short-term rental screenshots. I even played him the trail cam footage of the assistant trying to open the cabin door. He nodded slowly, taking notes, and said he had enough to file an incident report. I asked him if anything would come of it. He said it depended on whether the victims chose to press charges. I told him at least one of them was already writing a formal statement. Outside, the guests were mostly gone, some driving off in silence, others calling their bank. Marlene stood near the dock with her arms crossed, shouting at a man rolling up the banners. I could hear her through the trees, voice shrill and cracked, demanding to know who unplugged the music and why people were leaving without finishing dessert. I wondered how long she could pretend nothing was wrong. That illusion was wearing thin. By the time the last car rolled away, the event grounds looked like a deflated carnival. Trash on the grass, half-eaten sandwiches on paper plate, plastic cups bobbing near the water. I sat on the porch until full dark, flipping through the folder again. Everything was falling into place. Guests were talking. Screenshots were circulating. My cameras had done their job. I had clear documentation of lies, trespassing, false advertising, and personal profit disguised as community work. And best of all, I had the one clause in the old bylaws that gave the HOA board power to remove her. The final piece would be bringing it all to the next board meeting. But that would take more than evidence. It would take momentum. And after today, it was clear the tide was finally turning. As the stars came out over the lake and the last echoes of her failed party faded, I locked my cabin door for the night and smiled. She had thrown everything she had at me. Fake citations, rumors, intimidation, and now, even her own lies were starting to betray her. The guests were gone. The cabin was still locked, and the truth was about to be louder than any speaker system she could ever plug in. The morning after Marlene's event fell apart, I stepped outside to find a brand new violation notice duct-taped to my mailbox. This one was larger than the last and printed in all caps. Unauthorized perimeter barrier and visual obstruction of community lines of sight. I almost laughed. The gate on my driveway had been there for years, long before I even bought the place. It was in the original property listing photos. But Marlene had clearly decided if she could not win with charm or force, she would bury me in paperwork and hope I gave up. I tore the notice down, added it to the overflowing evidence folder, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee while scrolling through the messages that had started pouring in overnight. Apparently, the woman who confronted Marlene about the fake cabin listing had posted a detailed summary of her experience in the community board's private group. It spread fast. Her post included screenshots of her messages with the so-called assistant who had taken her money and ghosted her after the event fell apart. Other guests began chiming in, saying they had also made payments through similar back-channel method. One even claimed Marlene offered a discount if they didn't ask for receipt. I saved every screenshot, every comment, and every reply. With each hour, the digital stack of evidence grew stronger. People were starting to connect the dots. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. Later that day, a new twist arrived. A man I had never met showed up in a black pickup and introduced himself as a contractor who had done work on the community lodge last summer. He said he had seen the post about the fake cabin listing and thought it was time he spoke up. Marlene still owed him nearly $3,000 for labor and had blamed budget issues when he pressed her. He had tried to get the board involved but never received a response. I offered him coffee and sat him down on the porch. We swapped stories and timelines, and it became clear she had been using her role to funnel all sorts of favors and services without official approval. He agreed to write a formal statement and said he would gladly appear at a hearing if needed. I added his report to the folder and sent a copy to my lawyer, who replied almost immediately. That's the nail in the coffin. I spent the rest of the day walking the property with a notepad and checking the trail cameras. One had caught someone moving around near the back of the cabin around midnight. The person wore a hoodie and gloves, moved carefully, and appeared to be tampering with the irrigation line that fed my small garden. Sure enough, one of the hoses had been cut clean through. It wasn't a coincidence. I had checked that very section earlier in the week. I printed stills from the footage and placed them in a separate envelope marked sabotage. Then I made a backup copy on a thumb drive and mailed it to my lawyer just in case something happened to the original. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I was back on the porch watching the lake shimmer. A neighbor named Paula dropped by with a casserole dish and a smile. She said she had seen everything online and wanted to offer her support. She said her own father had been on the original HOA board when it was formed and would be disgusted by what it had become. We sat on the porch eating pasta and swapping stories about Marlene's long history of bullying people into silence. Paula said she remembered when Marlene accused a retired veteran of hoarding junk because he parked his vintage motorcycle under a tarp in his driveway. She handed me a list of names, people she thought would be willing to speak out. I thanked her and promised to follow up. The more voices we had, the harder it would be for Marlene to spin the truth. The next morning, I received an envelope from the county's zoning department. Inside was the official document confirming that my property fell completely outside the HOA's control. It included boundary maps, deed references, and a certification seal. I made 3 copies, laminated one, and posted it on the inside of my front window. That same day I dropped another copy in Marlene's mailbox with a sticky note that simply said cease all false claims. I knew she would lose her mind when she saw it, and frankly, I hoped she did. Let her feel a little of the helplessness she had spread around this place for years. By late afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the HOA office for an emergency board meeting. I wasn't officially a member, but thanks to the evidence I carried and the witnesses willing to testify, I had been invited to speak. Aunt Ruth arrived in a linen suit with a briefcase full of old meeting notes and smiled like she had waited a decade for this moment. Inside the small conference room, the air was thick with tension. Marlene sat at the head of the table with her usual icy composure, but there was a nervous twitch in her fingers as she flipped through her agenda. I walked in with Aunt Ruth and several neighbors behind me. People whispered. Phones recorded. It was clear the mood had shifted. When it was my turn, I laid the folder on the table and spoke clearly. I explained what had happened, from the fake rental listing to the trespassing attempts and the deliberate sabotage of my property. I presented screenshots, video stills, payment receipts, and testimonies from the victims. I read the section from the bylaws outlining the grounds for removal of the president and stated that this wasn't just a personal issue anymore. This was about abuse of power, misappropriation, and fraud. Every eye in the room turned to Marlene as she tried to respond, stumbling through denials and blaming rogue volunteers. But her voice shook. Her mask was slipping. Then the woman who had tried to rent my cabin stood up and shared her story in person. She explained how betrayed she felt, how much money she lost, and how Marlene made her feel like the problem when she asked for a refund. When she finished, the room fell silent. Even Marlene's usual defenders looked down at the table. Aunt Ruth stood next and read a list of past violations that had been buried or edited out of official records, each one tied back to Marlene or her hand-picked inner circle. The final speaker was the contractor who had come forward. He brought a printed invoice, a timeline, and copies of unanswered emails. He said he did not want revenge. He just wanted to be paid for his work and see the HOA return to honesty. By the end of the meeting, there was no fight left in her. A board member called for a vote, and hands went up one by one. Even the ones who hesitated finally raised theirs. It was unanimous. Marlene was removed from her position effective immediately. She stood, pale and silent, and walked out without saying a word. I watched her go with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It was over. After weeks of pressure, schemes, and battles, the door had finally closed behind her. And for the first time in a long time, the lake was quiet again. The next morning was unlike any I had experienced since arriving at the lake. There were no fake violation tags flapping in the wind, no HOA patrol cars circling my driveway, and no shouting echoing from the dock. Just silence. Peaceful, warm, undisturbed silence. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and breathed in the morning air like I was finally allowed to. After weeks of pressure, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. It was subtle but undeniable, like the tension in the air after a storm breaks, and the sky remembers how to be blue again. Later that day, I received a formal letter from the new acting president of the HOA board, a soft-spoken woman named Nadine, who had taken over after the vote. It expressed appreciation for my patience and cooperation during the investigation and extended an invitation for me to serve as a liaison between the board and surrounding non-HOA property owners. At first, I nearly tossed the letter into the trash out of habit, but I paused. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch. Maybe they were trying to clean up the mess and start fresh. I folded the letter and set it aside. I needed to think about it. News of Marlene's removal spread quickly. By that evening, neighbors I had never spoken to before were stopping by to shake my hand or drop off small gift. A man named Joel brought over a basket of apples from his orchard. A woman named Denise offered to repaint the dock fence as a thank you. Word had gotten out that I had stood up to the HOA bully who had made so many people's lives difficult. One neighbor even said he finally felt like he could put wind chimes back on his porch after years of them being banned for noise pollution. The ripple effect of Marlene's downfall was real, and it was restoring something that had been missing for a long time. I spent part of the day walking through the retreat grounds where the failed event had taken place. The banner was gone. The tables had been cleared. The lanterns had been packed away or tossed in a corner. But the space still looked tired, like it had carried too much for too long. I picked up a few stray pieces of litter and stood at the water's edge for a long while. The lake shimmered quietly, as if it too was recovering. I realized I no longer felt the need to watch my back every time I stepped outside. That weight had lifted. Later that afternoon, I received a phone call from a local news reporter who had been tipped off about the situation. She asked if I'd be willing to speak on record. I declined politely. This wasn't about publicity or praise. It was about protecting what was mine and making sure no one else had to fight the same ridiculous battle. But I did offer her copies of the documents and told her she was free to follow up with anyone involved. If that helped keep Marlene from weaseling her way into another board position elsewhere, then it was worth it. That night, I hosted another barbecue. This one was different. It wasn't about building alliances or swapping evidence. It was just about neighbors sitting together under the stars, sharing food and stories, and laughing without fear. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, passed around lemonade, and joked about who had survived the most bizarre HOA complaint. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought pie. And for a few hours, it felt like the lake community was what it had always been meant to be. Friendly, free, honest. Near the end of the night, Aunt Ruth pulled me aside and said she was proud of how I handled everything. She said the bylaws she helped write all those years ago were meant to protect the community, not control it. She handed me a faded photograph of the lake from the first summer the cabins were built. It showed a line of wooden chairs near the dock, fishermen in overalls, and kids splashing in the shallows. No rules, no permits, just people living beside the water with respect and care. She told me to keep that picture close. It was what the place used to stand for. Maybe it could again. Over the next few days, small changes began to appear. People painted fences that had been left dull and gray for too long. Wind chimes returned. Garden gnomes reemerged. One family installed a tree swing their daughter had begged for years ago but had been told it would violate sightlines. Nadine, the new president, sent out a community message promising transparency and fairness going forward. She even invited residents to a town hall discussion where everyone could voice concerns or share ideas, not just board members. It was the first time in years that people seemed genuinely excited to be part of something rather than fearful of it. Then, one morning, I walked outside and noticed something taped to the front of my gate. My stomach tensed until I saw what it was. A handwritten note in neat cursive on floral stationery. It read, "Thank you for not backing down. You helped all of us." No name. No return address. Just those words. I smiled, folded the note, and slipped it into the same folder where I had once stored every bit of evidence. Only now that folder felt more like a relic of a battle that had finally ended. A week later, I finally decided to accept Nadine's offer and joined the liaison group. Not because I wanted power or influence, but because I wanted to make sure no one else got pushed around by whoever sat in that chair next. I showed up at the next board meeting and was greeted not with suspicion but with nods of recognition and a few quiet thank yous. The mood in the room was lighter, like a window had been opened after years of stale air. As I drove back to the cabin that evening, I looked out at the water and saw kids paddling in kayaks near the shore. Families laughing. No megaphones. No warnings. Just life, unbothered. I pulled into my driveway and saw a group of teens taking selfies near the welcome sign. One of them pointed at my porch and said, "That's the guy who kept the cabin locked." The others laughed and gave a thumbs up. I waved back. Maybe that would be my legacy here. The guy who locked his door and refused to hand over what was his. Who didn't cave when the pressure mounted. Who reminded everyone that private property still means something and peace is worth protecting. That night, I lit a small fire in the pit and sat back with a blanket and a book. The frogs croaked along the shoreline. The trees rustled in the breeze. And for the first time in a long time, I slept with the windows open. The weeks that followed settled into a kind of rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. With Marlene gone and the HOA leadership reset, the lake felt like it was finally breathing again. The mornings were quiet except for birdsong and the occasional hum of a distant boat motor. No one paced the edges of my property line. No one scribbled fake citations or left notes about dock measurement. For the first time since I arrived, I felt like the land itself had remembered it belonged to people who cared, not people who controlled. It was strange how silence could feel like victory. One morning, I walked down to the dock and saw an envelope tucked beneath a smooth river stone. It had no name on it, but inside was a photocopy of a check written from Marlene's personal account to someone named Dana Caldwell. The note beside it said she was paying people to post 5-star reviews for the fake cabin listing. There was no signature on the note, but I recognized the handwriting. It belonged to one of the HOA board members who had voted to remove her. I added it to the folder, even though the war was technically over. It felt important to preserve the truth. Not for revenge, but for record. So people would never forget what nearly happened here. That afternoon I got a call from the woman who had tried to rent my cabin. She said the bank had finished its fraud investigation and refunded her money. She thanked me for standing up and said she and her husband were planning to return next season, this time to a legitimate rental, and hoped to stop by to say hello. I told her she was welcome to visit anytime, but the cabin was still not for rent. She laughed and said she wouldn't dream of asking. She just wanted to see the infamous porch where the HOA drama finally came to an end. The new HOA board was surprisingly proactive in restoring goodwill. They launched a monthly bulletin that actually included resident input and removed Marlene's old rules that banned things like lawn flamingos, picnic benches, and even tomato trellises over a certain height. Apparently, she had taken offense to the color red in any form. Neighbors began to relax. People started painting their cabins in brighter colors. One family even started a weekend art market near the common grounds, something Marlene had shut down years ago because it was too informal. It was like a curtain had lifted and the people here had remembered how to live instead of just comply. I started keeping my front gate open during the day. Kids rode their bikes past the cabin and waved. Hikers asked if they could take the shortcut along the edge of the water, and I said yes as long as they respected the space. Respect. That was the difference now. The people who came by asked instead of assumed. They waved instead of demanded. And every so often, someone would quietly mention that what I did had made them feel like they had a voice again. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up with a wooden sign I had commissioned weeks earlier, back when the conflict was still fresh. I opened the package and smiled. It was a thick piece of oak carved with a simple message. Private property unlocked only for friends. I mounted it near the front porch beside a flower bed Ruth had helped me replant. It wasn't meant to be hostile. It was a quiet boundary. A reminder that kindness wasn't the same as permission, and that generosity worked best when it wasn't taken for granted. As the summer stretched on, the lake welcomed more visitors, but none of the chaos that had come with Marlene's events. The retreat grounds remained available but were now booked through a transparent system that capped attendance and required clear approval. The fake luxury listings disappeared, and not a single new violation notice appeared on my property. For fun, I started growing peppers in the side garden and put up a hand-painted sign that read "Not HOA approved." People loved it. A few even took pictures. It became something of a local inside joke. One weekend, the board invited me to speak at a community gathering, just a short story about standing up for yourself. I was reluctant at first, but Ruth encouraged me. So I stood there by the fire pit, surrounded by neighbors I barely knew 6 months ago, and told them about the night someone tried to pry open the cabin door. I told them how it felt to be treated like a trespasser on your own land. But I also told them how it felt to win, not through yelling or threats, but with patience, evidence, and a door that stayed locked no matter how many people demanded otherwise. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded quietly, which felt better than applause. The strangest part of it all was how quickly Marlene vanished from everyone's conversations. It was as if the community had chosen to move on without her, like a bad chapter in a book that no one wanted to reread. I heard rumors she had moved to another state. Someone said she was trying to start over in a gated community 2 towns over. But this time, people were asking questions. Word travels fast in places like this. Her name had become a cautionary tale. Not a threat. Just a reminder. One night in early autumn, long after the tourists had left and the leaves had started to blush red and gold, I sat by the fire pit alone. The air was crisp. The lake was still. I thought back to that first morning when Marlene banged on my door, acting like she owned the trees, the water, and everything in between. And I remembered how I stood there, half in disbelief, half in quiet anger, refusing to hand over a key to someone who believed she was entitled to everything she could see. That moment felt like a lifetime ago. And yet, it was exactly where everything had begun. The fire crackled. An owl called from somewhere near the treetop. And I smiled, not out of triumph, but out of peace. The cabin was still mine. The door was still locked. And the land, finally, was free from her shadow. Not because I fought to own it louder than she did, but because I held my ground when it counted. And that, in the end, made all the difference.